Today on the Word Preacher podcast, a double standard, a double murderer, and an unconquered kingdom. I'm Brett Jensen, and this is the Word Preacher podcast. All right, our Come Follow Me curriculum for the coming week will bring us to sections 135 and 136 of the Doctrine and Covenants. We're going to talk about the circumstances that surround section 135 and do a couple of verses and leave 136 to you as an exercise. Let's talk about a double standard that was frequently applied to the prophet Joseph Smith. Enemies of the church had long since labeled him a disturber of the peace, that through his teachings he was a, quote, traitor to civilized society, a dangerous voice that needed to be shut down. He was persecuted in New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Missouri. Why would Illinois be different? Joseph Smith had to be guarded with how he interacted with people. And on several occasions, it was better for him to flee and have friends help establish the truth surrounding claims against him, the truth that these claims were baseless, instead of submitting himself to the quote-unquote authorities, as he had done when he was dragged to Liberty Jail and robbed without any due process, trial, or conviction. Robbed and tortured without due process, trial, or conviction. So being accused of involvement in the assassination attempt of Governor Boggs of Missouri was another incident that required the prophet kind of go into hiding for a bit, because the standard seemed to be, when this was applied generally, that public peace, or even the perception of public peace, is more important than freedom. It was better, to just kind of ignore the rules and establish public tranquility, even if it cost freedom. This is exactly what the standard was that had been applied to Joseph Smith over and over again. You need to stop preaching. You need to leave. You need to give up your freedoms. You need to rot in a dungeon so that everyone else can have a little bit more public peace. So when enemies of the church began a newspaper in Nauvoo called the Nauvoo Expositor, which was essentially just a piece of propaganda meant to discredit the prophet and embolden those who wanted to violently overthrow the Church of Jesus Christ, it makes a little bit of sense in this context. He had some experience, certainly the entire church had some experience with being robbed, plundered, and butchered by angry people. And if public peace is more important than freedom, when you recognize that these same patterns are being used by the Nauvoo Expositor in a very clear and straightforward manner, it seems like a very reasonable thing to do to follow that standard and declare this paper, the Expositor, a public nuisance and order it to be destroyed. And when there's a bunch of danger of people that are going to cause violence, using militia to control the peace in a martial law type situation might seem temporarily appropriate. It was certainly used against them repeatedly. However, when Joseph Smith and the leaders in Nauvoo used the same standard that had been applied against them, suddenly the enemies of the church became really, really concerned with quote-unquote freedom of expression. I mean, of course, not for the prophet, not for the church, not for Joseph Smith, but for the Nauvoo expositor. They needed their freedom of expression. Illinois Governor Thomas Ford promised to provide protection to Joseph Smith if he turned himself in. He insisted that he would receive a fair trial for dealing with these crimes that had been perpetrated against them, and that Governor Ford was also concerned with what? Not freedom, public peace, establishing public peace. So Joseph, he was ready to go into hiding with Hiram. But he didn't want to hide. This felt like a cowardly thing to do, that he was just running away anytime there was any danger. He disliked this idea a lot, and he said so to those that were with him. He asked Porter Rockwell what they should do, and Porter Rockwell said, his bodyguard said, well, you're older. You need to decide. And Hiram was there, and he said, well, you're older. What do you think we should do? And Hiram said, we should turn ourselves in. Joseph said that if they did, they would be butchered. And Hiram replied, if we live or have to die, we will be reconciled to our fate. Joseph considered that for a moment and then agreed they would turn themselves in. Now, Emma had sent Joseph away, kind of expecting him to flee to safety, and she sees him coming back, and this was not something that made her happy. She was terrified. That night, he blessed his wife and each of his children. The next morning, he kissed each of them. Emma, emotionally, said, you are coming back. Joseph mounted his horse and said, I am going like a lamb to the slaughter, but I am as calm as a summer's morning. I have a conscience void of offense towards God and towards all men. Of course, when they arrived in Carthage, they were not greeted with peaceful. It wasn't something that promoted peace and tranquility. It provoked this big mob that whooped and hollered and threatened and did all sorts of unpeaceful things as they surrounded the accused prophet and his brother. After a brief hearing in court, it was determined that Joseph and Hiram would be released to await trial for the charges of starting a riot. But before they could leave, complaints issued by some enemies of the church associated with William Sharp and other critics of Joseph Smith, they issued these additional complaints accusing them of treason against the government for declaring martial law in Nauvoo. And because this was a capital offense, it suddenly made them ineligible for bail. Now, Governor Ford, he promised that he would make sure they were protected. He was going to go and make sure that the members of the church weren't going to start any kind of rebellion. He would bring Joseph and Hiram to show that they were safe and that there was no cause for rebellion. But instead, the governor came with just this large militia without the prophet or his brother. And when in Nauvoo, this impartial governor, only concerned with justice and peace, told the saints that they were responsible for what happened with the expositor and everything that was coming upon them, and that they bore some responsibility for placing the city under martial law, and that if they rebelled against his decisions, they would face the torch. They would be exterminated. He threatened them with extermination. Now, of course, Joseph had told people not to resist, that they were cooperating with the law, so nothing was done. But they marched a big parade of militia through the town and swung their swords to menace and intimidate these people who were just trying to live in peace. Okay. Let's talk about the double murder. Some of the men who had accompanied Joseph had left to run errands, but they provided some means of defense for the prophet: a revolver, a single-shot pistol, a sturdy walking stick nicknamed the Rascal Beater. These were left after having been smuggled in as kind of a last effort in case something bad happened, in case the mob came. They had certainly not been provided the protection that the governor had promised. John Taylor and Willard Richards were the only two still in the room with the prophet and his brother on the afternoon of June 27th, 1844. John Taylor sung the hymn, "A Poor Wayfaring Man of Grief." And after that, there was some rustling, a few gunshots, as about 150 men with blackened faces stormed the jail. Joseph and Hiram reached for the guns. John Taylor and Willard Richard had canes, and they went to brace the door. But a musket ball went through the door, splintering the wood and striking Hiram in the face. Joseph fired the revolver through the crack in the door. It misfired a few times. Others tried to beat down the bayonets and gun barrels that were reaching into the cell. Hoping to appeal to some form to the mob for some form of mercy, Joseph rushed toward the window and exclaimed, "O Lord, my God!" But he was hit with multiple musket balls, and he crashed out the window. Section 135 of the Doctrine and Covenants is the announcement regarding their murder. We'll read a little bit from this. In verse 3, it reads, "Joseph Smith, the prophet and seer of the Lord, has done more, save Jesus only, for the salvation of men in this world than any other man that ever lived in it. In the short space of 20 years, he has brought forth the Book of Mormon, which he translated by the gift and power of God, and has been the means of publishing it on 2 continents, has sent the fullness of the everlasting gospel which it contained to the 4 quarters of the earth, has brought forth the revelations and commandments which compose this book of Doctrine and Covenants, and many other wise documents and instructions for the benefit of the children of men, gathered many thousands of the Latter-day Saints, founded a great city, and left a fame and a name that cannot be slain. He lived great, and he died great in the eyes of God and his people, and like most of the Lord's anointed in ancient times, has sealed his mission and his works with his own blood. And so has his brother Hiram. In life they were not divided, and in death they were not separated." Verse 6. Hiram Smith was 44 years old in February 1844, and Joseph Smith was 38 in December 1843, and henceforth their names will be classed among the martyrs of religion. And the reader in every nation will be reminded that the Book of Mormon and this book of Doctrine and Covenants of the Church cost the best blood of the 19th century to bring them forth for the salvation of a ruined world, and that if the fire can scathe a green tree for the glory of God, how easy it will burn up the dry trees to purify the vineyard of corruption. They lived for glory. They died for glory. And glory is their eternal reward. From age to age shall their names go down to posterity as gems for the sanctified. They were innocent of any crime, as they had often been proved before, and were only confined in jail by the conspiracy of traitors and wicked men. All right, the aftermath. Many people believed that the church would evaporate after the death of the prophet. There were some people who did leave, who went to do their own thing, but the apostles of Jesus Christ endured. The temple was completed. The ordinances were administered. The prophecies that Joseph gave have been and are being fulfilled. Now, there are those who criticize Joseph. Indeed, from the comfort of their cushioned seats and heated homes, they emphasize the imperfections of the prophet. They suggest that he could have done things differently or better, that he was at times problematic. They claim to study history but ignore all of God's dealings with prophets from the days of Adam. And like Pharisees, they delight in their own piety through the corrupted lens of presentism. Of course, we don't worship Joseph. In fact, we don't even revere Joseph to the degree that Protestants venerate the Apostle Paul or Catholics venerate the Apostle Peter. We do, however, rejoice at the truths that God has given us through Joseph Smith, just as we rejoice at the truths that we have received from Moses, from Peter, from Paul, from Isaiah, and from Daniel. A worthwhile perspective on the prophet comes from a man named William W. Phelps, a man who gained a testimony but then had problems with the prophet Joseph Smith, even testifying in Missouri against him and the church. But late in 1838, Brother Phelps humbled himself. He confessed and begged forgiveness. Joseph Smith explained that even though they had been deeply hurt by his actions, that he was happy to extend the hand of fellowship to him again, giving him this couplet, "Come on, dear brother, since the war is past, for friends at first are friends again at last." What kind of man was Joseph Smith? William W. Phelps, who had seen both the ups and downs firsthand, wrote some words that you may recognize. These are they. Praise to the man who communed with Jehovah. Jesus anointed that prophet and seer. Blessed to open the last dispensation, kings shall extol him, and nations revere. Praise to his memory, he died as a martyr. Honored and blessed be his ever great name. Long shall his blood, which was shed by assassins, plead unto heaven while the earth lauds his fame. Great is his glory, and endless his priesthood. Ever and ever the keys he will hold. Faithful and true he will enter his kingdom, crowned in the midst of the prophets of old. Sacrifice brings forth the blessings of heaven. Earth must atone for the blood of that man. Wake up the world for the conflict of justice. Millions shall know brother Joseph again. Hail to the prophet ascended to heaven. Traitors and tyrants now fight him in vain. Mingling with gods, he can plan for his brethren. Death cannot conquer the hero again. In the end, Joseph Smith may not be perfect, but he is absolutely better than those who fight him in vain. He knew what awaited him in Carthage, and he faced it anyway. If we will apply to him the same standards that we apply to ourselves, we will see him as he is. He will be revealed a hero, a prophet, a faithful servant of Jesus Christ. We appreciate all the support for the Word Preacher podcast. Next week, we will look at sections 137 and 138, discussing redemption of the dead. There's a lot that we did not talk about in this week's reading. Please study that individually and with your family. And of course, as always, fight on.